Hey guys, tonight we stand at the edge of a yawning stone archway. The rough-hewn walls slick with centuries of damp, and you probably won't survive this. You squint into inky darkness that smells of mildew, coppery iron, and the faintest hint of old torch smoke, like your forgotten wallet at the bottom of a medieval purse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so we know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you trudge down 3 crooked steps, your footfalls echo, each thunk reminding you that these passageways were carved by hands long dead. Castles across Europe often built these subterranean cells beneath their keeps. As early as the 11th century, mainstream historical fact intended to hold miscreants and debtors until trial or ransom arrival. The air grows colder, almost viscous, and you feel the ancient chill seep into your bones. A single shaft of flickering torchlight reveals iron rings bolted to the wall where prisoners were once shackled. Nearby, a crudely fashioned latrine trapdoor gapes open fringe rumor says some inmates survived by catching bat droppings from the rafters, boiling them into a disgusting but protein-rich stew. Historians still argue whether such diets extended life or accelerated despair. You wonder if your stomach could bear that culinary adventure. The narrow corridor opens into a low-ceilinged chamber. Your shoulder brushes ancient moss, and you almost wish you had worn shoulder pads. A distant drip water or something else keeps time like a warped metronome. This is the gateway to darkness, where countless souls spent their final, waking hours. Modern asides flicker through your mind. Imagine complaining about slow Wi-Fi down here. Your heart taps a nervous rhythm as you step onto uneven flagstones. Rats skid around your boots. There are more of them than you thought possible outside viral pet videos. One bold creature peers at you, whiskers twitching, perhaps judging your flashlight skills. You offer it a crumb you don't have. Off to your left, a small alcove holds the remains of wooden bunks. Splintered boards lie rotting in the filth. Prisoners slept sitting up to avoid slipping into their own excrement. It's a quirky but grim tidbit that feels like the worst Airbnb review imaginable. Through a low arch, the corridor twists into an even darker hallway. You hear the faint clink of chains, echoing from cells you can't quite see. Many castle dungeons were so poorly ventilated that prisoners suffocated within days, a grim statistic every tour guide tactfully omits. Historians still argue whether those conditions were accidental or deliberate cruelty. Your flashlight flickers, and you chide yourself for relying on technology in a place that predates electricians by centuries. The beam wobbles across scrawled symbols carved into the rock prisoners' attempts at leaving a message for posterity, or maybe just doodles to stave off madness. Some cells had primitive toilets, essentially holes over pits. The smell is so pungent you can almost taste it, a wild contrast to modern air fresheners claiming mountain breeze. At least your bathroom back home has toilet paper. You pause to listen. Beyond the corridor, a soft breeze whistles an air shaft meant to provide minimal ventilation, or perhaps a cruel reminder that the world above remains populated by the living. One scholar speculates these shafts doubled as confession lines for priests. Others see them as mere structural flukes. Historians still argue whether they were functional theology or engineering oversight. Your foot slips on a puddle that glints with strange hues, a combination of mold and mineral runoff. You imagine posting a mugshot of your soggy boot on social media with the caption, "Dungeon Chic." It probably wouldn't trend, but it's tempting. Ahead lies a heavy oak door bound with iron bands. This is your official invitation to descend further, into chambers built for misery. You draw a deep breath tonight. You're not just a viewer. You're an unwilling participant in centuries old drama, and with that, you step through. As you step beyond the oak threshold, the air grows even colder. Remember that damp tug at your collar back in the entry? And you realize these stone corridors weren't always destined to hold bodies. In early medieval Europe, justice often meant banishment, fines, or even public shaming stalls rather than locked cells, a mainstream historical fact. During the Carolingian era, local sheriffs rode out to settle disputes under trees or on village greens. Only by the 12th century did kings and lords begin building dedicated jails to contain debtors, vagrants, and petty thieves. You trudge past a pile of broken iron shackles that clink like reluctant applause. Before the concept of permanent incarceration took hold, many communities practiced ordeal by water, or public stocks, think dunk tanks and park benches for your worst enemies. Fringe accounts whisper of a cleric who voluntarily locked himself in a cell for a year to atone for Sin-San early performance art piece, perhaps. Historians still argue whether such self-imprisonments were genuine penance or merely theatrical protest. Lean close to the cool wall and feel the rough chisel marks made by stonemason siege gouge, a testament to a shift from itinerant punishments to permanent punishment spaces. Initially, jails served as holding pens where bail could be posted, not places for execution. You might imagine the relief of a prisoner hearing, "Trial tomorrow," echo down these halls, a phrase rarer than a snowstorm in Provence. As your lantern light dances across a faded inscription, perhaps a name, maybe a curse, you sense how inconsistent these early locks were. Some cells used wooden bars so wide you could slip through if you contorted like a carnival performer. Other vaults relied on single iron grills, leaving prisoners exposed to pebbles and taunts from guards above. One strange rumor suggests certain lords installed glass peephole-esque precursors to reality TV. Historians still argue whether they actually survived or remain myth. You shuffle onward, toe-kicking a small pile of straw that served as makeshift bedding. Originally, most communities preferred pilfered straw piles over stone benches, believing condemned souls deserved minimal comfort, but not too much, of course. A popular anecdote claims that some village elders spiced straw with nettles to discourage napping quaint torture by mattress. Feel the echo of your breath merge with the distant drip of water as you learn that jails evolved in response to growing trade and urbanization. As towns swelled, kings needed a way to enforce contracts and protect merchants. London's earliest prison, the Cornhill Prison, opened in the late 1100s to detain insolvent traders. Imagine the chaos. Traders bargaining over spilled grain, now barred underground for bad bookkeeping. This practical shift to mainstream fact laid the groundwork for the grand dungeons you've just begun to explore. You pause at a crossway where two narrow passages meet a junction, representing the crossroads between medieval mercy and cruelty. Here, the idea of prison as punishment took shape. Wealthy debtors could bribe guards to stay in the Lord's castle tower, enjoying rudimentary comforts. Meanwhile, lower classes languished in dank cells, knee-deep in muck. A scandalous fringe tale speaks of a lord who let his pet falcon fly through cell grates to deliver messages. Historians still argue whether that bird was real or a metaphor for clandestine rescue. As the corridor constricts, you notice crudely engraved Christian symbols and runes prayer talismans etched by frightened hands. Early jails were frequently under church jurisdiction, merging spiritual penance with secular restraint. Some clerics claimed incarceration saved souls by offering ample time for prayer. Skeptics argue it was merely state-sponsored isolation. A distant clang jolts you guards, reinforcing newer locks, retrofitted during the 13th century crime wave tied to famine and unrest. These reinforced doors marked a turning point. Dungeons moved from ad hoc lockups to purpose-built subterranean prisons. The design prioritized containment over comfort. You can almost hear the blacksmith's hammer, each strike echoing a society growing less forgiving. Your lantern's glow reveals floor graffiti noms, dates, angry scratches that feel as raw as modern protest slogans. A peculiar footnote in some records suggests that certain prisoners choreographed rudimentary dances to pass time. Fringe scholars debate whether these qualify as genuine medieval flash mobs. Historians still argue whether such performances were coping mechanisms or desperate madness. You follow the corridor as it slopes downward, carrying you deeper into the origins of medieval incarceration. The stones underfoot shift from dressed blocks to rough quarry-cut slabs, signaling you've moved from improvised village jails to the deliberate architecture of feudal authority. Every drip, clank, and distant murmur reminds you that this place was born from evolving social needs-punishing wrongdoers, securing debt repayment, and reinforcing hierarchical power. With each step, you sense how the concept of jail grew from a practical afterthought into an instrument of control. What began as a temporary holding pen for unruly villagers matured into the chilling subterranean labyrinth you now inhabit. Remember that frigid draft from the entry? Here, the chill is deeper, not just in temperature but in intention designed to break spirits long before the iron bolts did. As you round a final bend, the corridor widens into a low-ceilinged antechamber. Your first glimpse of a true medieval jail. Purpose, built with thick walls and reinforced doors. Ahead lies the heart of incarceration's origins, a threshold into institutional punishment, where monks once debated morality above and prisoners suffered below. And you, dear listener, are about to witness the birth of medieval imprisonment itself. You step into a squat stone chamber just above the castle's great gatehouse. The air warm compared to the dank corridors below. Remember that icy breeze in Section 1? Here, the granite block ceilings hum with tension, as if the walls themselves anticipate each creak of your boots. Lords of the medieval world rarely had time for subtlety. Gatehouse holding rooms were their first line of detention for petty criminals, debtors, and drunken peasants who mistook the drawbridge for a tavern floor. These cramped cells, often called oubliettes though, that term more accurately describes shaft dungeons, were little more than windowless boxes built into the keep's upper levels. A mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, most fortified manor houses in England and France included temporary holding chambers above or beside their main entrance, intended to house up to a dozen rogues at once. You probably wouldn't survive a winter here without your Netflix password, and even then, the buffering would kill you. Your shoulder grazes a rusted iron ring protruding from the wall, likely used to shackle particularly unruly inmates. The metal is pitted with centuries of corrosion. You can almost smell the iron oxide mixed with stale urine and unwashed wool. Fringe rumor has it that some lords installed small peepholes, barely larger than your fingertip, so they could peek in and enjoy the display. Historians still argue whether these peepholes were commonplace or merely a baronial legend. You imagine a bored noble sipping mead behind the wall, flicking your flashlight on his imprisoned great-uncle. The floor is covered in a thin crust of sawdust, once meant to absorb liquid, an early attempt at hygiene that mostly failed. You crouch to examine it. Flecks of straw and bits of bone glimmer like glitter in the torchlight. Inmates sometimes collected bones dropped by rats and fashioned dice engaging in midnight gambling sessions beneath the Lord's feet. That's one way to pass time when solitaire apps don't exist. A narrow slit window, high above, lets in a sliver of pale sky. It's barely large enough to pass a loaf of stale bread, smuggled by sympathetic townsfolk or unscrupulous guards hoping for a bribe. You press your ear to the cold stone, half expecting the murmur of the courtyard. The faint echo of hooves on cobblestone drifts upward, an auditory reminder that life carries on outside these walls, unlike the next-tier dungeon below, where hope climbs at a glacial pace. The doorway to the adjacent cell is reinforced with iron bands, its wooden planks swollen from moisture. A corroded latch clatters when you brush it, producing a hollow knock that resonated throughout the keep, signaling to guards that a prisoner had deador. Less frequently, that someone had finally paid their ransom. It's remarkable how quickly human life became a ledger note. One criminal, fee pending. You're tempted to add plus 20% service charge in chalk. You notice faint scorch marks on the ceiling beams, evidence of torch sconces that once lit the space. The flickering torchlight would have cast dancing shadows across prisoners' faces, intensifying fears of unseen horrors. Fringe accounts suggest some captives attempted to signal allies outside by reflecting light through bits of battered metal like an awkward medieval galaxy brain TikTok trend. Historians still argue whether such creative escapes ever succeeded or were simply desperate imaginings. As you back away, your foot bumps a small wooden bucket braced in the corner another primitive toilet. Inmates were expected to relieve themselves, then sit atop their own waste until guards collected it the next morning. The stench would build in layers, much like a bad group chat. Pungent, unavoidable, and guaranteed to ruin your mood. You inhale once and your eyes water. At least you won't have to worry about pollen allergies in here. Tucked beneath a narrow bench, you find a crudely carved message. Jay the baker was robbed by Sir Geoffrey. 1,298. Someone recorded a grievance, hoping posterity might intervene. You trace the letters with a fingertip-cold stone against warmer skin, feeling an intimate link to that long-ago baker. That small act of protest feels oddly comforting, like reading an online review before booking a hotel. Turning toward the door, you spot a trapdoor set flush to the floor. This is no mere waste chute. It's the drop to the true dungeon level. Keys to this hatch were kept by the castle constable if he was feeling benevolent. Fringe anecdotes claim that, on special feast days, lords would open this trapdoor and let in traveling minstrels to perform for the incarcerated. Historians still argue whether these events were genuine attempts at charity or macabre entertainment. You imagine a lute-strumming bard singing medieval pop covers, surrounded by iron-barred walls. You press your hand against the trapdoor. The wood is dry and splintered. Up here, air is stale but breathable. Below, temperatures plummet and oxygen dwindles. The vertical shaft was often lined with simple timber supports, allowing guards to lower food and messages via rope primitive room service for the damned. One surviving ledger notes that some prisoners received visits from friends on the castle battlements, who tossed down coins or letters. A quirky image. Castle aristocrats hosting subterranean mail drops like medieval Amazon Prime. Your stomach growls a reminder that hunger was as ever-present as the ringing of distant church bells. A single loaf of coarse rye bread, sometimes cut into cubes and boiled into gruel, was considered adequate rations for several days. Yet more fringe lore suggests some captives discovered wild mushrooms growing in the damp corners of these chambers and risked poisoning for a morsel of variety. Historians still argue whether poisoning incidents were common or merely sanitized by record keepers. You crouch beside the trapdoor, listening for movement below. You hear muffled clanks and a hollow thud, perhaps a guard making his rounds, or just the echo of your torch striking the wall. In this intermediate level, prisoners were technically above the worst cruelties, but still far from any hope of daylight. It's the ground zero of medieval detention, where discomfort and fear blend into a coarse tapestry. A guard's iron boot imprint in the mud outside once marked the spot where offenses were judged. Those dragged here by their ankles feet first or head first. We're not sure would live in this cramped antechamber until trial. Debtors, thieves, and even political rivals found themselves here, awaiting whatever fate their lord decided. You shiver, not just from the chill, but from imagining your own shadowed reflection in a pool of stagnant water. As you stand, you realize these castle keeps and holding cells were not intended for long-term occupancy. They were the warm-up act before the main event, the deeper, colder dungeons that would test even the hardiest spirit. Yet in their own right, these upper-level cages served as potent symbols of feudal authority. Cross me, and I'll lock you in this box above my front door. It's the medieval version of blocking on social media, but with actual iron bars. You step toward the steep stair that leads downward, away from the faint glow of lamplight and toward the silent depths. Behind you, the trapdoor creaks, as if warning you not to proceed. But proceed you must. The next level awaits with darker chambers, crueler designs, and the true heart of subterranean punishment. And so, with a final glance at the dusty cell above the gatehouse, you descend. You duck under a low stone lintel and step into the heart of the fortress's subterranean dungeon, where the walls curve inward in a seamless barrel vault. Remember that trapdoor overhead in Section 3? And you're suddenly aware of how the castle's weight presses down on you from all sides. By the late 12th century, many European castles had purpose-built underground chambers carved directly into bedrock beneath curtain walls. Mainstream historical fact designed both to contain prisoners and to stabilize ramparts above. Your lantern beam wobbles across the rough-hewn stones. Each block was painstakingly chiseled by masons who were paid in ale and leftover bread. The vaulted ceiling arches overhead like an inverted hull of a ship, a clever medieval trick to support tons of masonry above without fancy steel girders. You can almost hear the echo of hammer on chisel, each clang a step toward the dungeon's grim completion. Modern asides flicker through your mind. Thank goodness you don't have to endure this with a backhoe. At your feet, the floor slopes gently toward a narrow stone channel carved along the wall's edge. This primitive drainage gutter let waste and rainwater out through a hidden external drain, preventing floods or at least reducing them to ankle-high muck. Fringe rumor claims that some ingenious prisoners used the channel to float secret messages on scraps of parchment, sending them downstream like doomed paper boats. Historians still argue whether those messages ever reached their intended recipients or simply fueled aquatic folklore. You touch the cool stone and feel ridges where pitch was once smeared to seal cracks, an early waterproofing method. Above each cell's entrance, you notice small T-shaped vents, primitive air shafts that funneled fresh breeze from courtyards above. Yet the shafts were so narrow that only a whisper could drift through more taunt than relief. Some captives carved marks around these openings, counting days by the bit of sky visible at midnight. A quirky tidbit. One legend speaks of a prisoner who trained pigeons to deliver tiny scrolls through the shaft. Historians still argue whether medieval homing pigeons tackled dungeon deliveries or preferred rooftops. The cells themselves are as varied as the crimes they punished. To your right, a rectangular chamber barely wide enough to stretch your arms. To your left, a circular oubliette sunk into the floor, its walls slick with moisture. Oubliettes literally. Forgotten places had no benches, no shelves. Just a thin ledge carved 3 feet above the ground for a grim version of a bunk. Imagine trying to sleep there without slipping into the pit below a medieval carnival ride you wouldn't choose even with a fast pass. You step into one rectangular cell and inhale deeply if your lungs weren't already used to Netflix binging on fresh air. The scent here is a cocktail of moldy stone, damp straw, and yesterday's gruel. Straw bedding lay piled on the floor, occasionally replaced when turnover was high if guards remembered. Archaeologists find bits of straw mixed with animal hair, evidence that rat sand sometimes captured these cramped quarters. Fringe accounts suggest some prisoners trained cats to smuggle scraps of bread from the kitchens. Historians still argue whether this was clever survival or medieval fantasy. In the corner stands a simple latrine, a stone bench with a semicircular hole. Beneath it, a deep pit collected waste, emptied only during quarterly hygiene days when the castle's servants lowered themselves into the depths to shovel muck, an unpleasant job rivaling the dankest modern sewage works. You envision shouting, "BRB, just clearing a clog," if those servants had cell phones. Above the latrine, a rough-hewn niche holds a chipped pottery jug likely for water or cheap wine rations. A fringe tale insists some captives brewed mead from spilled sugars mixed with dungeon water, crafting a potent brew they dubbed stone cider. Historians still argue whether any recipe survived or remains buried under layers of silt and speculation. Your light dances across a second air shaft, this one reinforced with wooden beams to prevent collapse. The shaft, couldn't resist funnels of faint breeze that smells faintly of wildflowers from above-ground gardens. Prison architects knew a little fresh air kept rats sated and minds slightly less frayed, though the gesture was more practical than compassionate. In contrast, other castles omitted air shafts entirely, condemning occupants to suffocating darkness and architectural choice you wouldn't want to Google reviews for. Toward the far end of the hall, you spot a thicker section of wall pierced by a small square window outfitted with iron grill bars. Prisoners sometimes etched pleas for mercy or names of loved ones around these bars, hoping that guards or passers-by might glance down and grant a reprieve. You run your fingertip over one message scrawled in shaky letters. "Maria, forgive me." It feels intimate, like reading someone's unpublished diary if your diary were scratched into rock with a dagger. Inset into another cell's side wall, you find a shallow niche designed to hold oil lamps. The cup-shaped impression in stone still bears scorch marks evidence that medieval lanterns burned whale oil or tallow, filling cells with flickering light that danced off damp walls. Imagine complaining on social media about low battery. Medieval prisoners complained about low oil levels. Both can drive you mad. At the center of the corridor, an iron ring set flush into the wall marks the spot where heavier restraints where fastened chains would swing down, locking around ankles or wrists. The dangling irons now scratch the floor, producing an unnerving squeal like rusty scissors. You stand still, listening to that squeal echo around the vault, a reminder that architecture wasn't just stone and mortar, but a psychological instrument for crushing morale. As you move on, the corridor narrows into a tunnel so tight you brush both sides simultaneously. Carved arrow loops designed originally for defenders above to shoot arrows were sometimes repurposed by jailers to spray buckets of cold water on prisoners below. Fringe rumors says some guards enjoyed using these loops to play water polo with captives. Historians still argue whether that was a sanctioned pastime or parkour gone wrong. Finally, you arrive at a domed chamber, the dungeon's heart. Here, the ceiling rises 2 full meters, supported by an octagonal stone pillar in the center. The pillar's base is encircled by a shallow trough likely for cooling wine for later feasts, then repurposed to smear mud on prisoners dragged in. The multi-purpose use of Space Banquet Hall by day, Torture Hub by night underscores how medieval architecture prized adaptability. You can practically hear lords deciding, "Let's host a feast on Tuesday, water torture on Wednesday." Your lantern flickers again, revealing carved runic symbols above a recessed air shaft. These symbols weren't just decoration, they were protective talismans prisoners believed they could stave off plague and poison. A quirky tidbit. One cell contained a miniature altar where inmates burned incense hoping for divine intervention. Historians still argue whether the church condoned these rituals or frowned upon them. You linger in that domed chamber, feeling the full weight of centuries. It's here that architecture becomes almost alive, walls absorbing the collective sorrow of thousands. You rub your shoulder where it hit the bone vault earlier, wincing in memory-like, repeating a bad stretch after a lazy gym day. Behind you, the corridor snakes onward, deeper into darkness where the next section awaits. But for now, you've traced the fortress's subterranean blueprint vaults, shafts, drains, and cramped cell saw orchestrated to confine both body and spirit. And as you step back into the you step into a low-ceilinged cell where the stale air wraps around you like a damp blanket. Remember that dank vault from Section 4? This is ground zero for daily misery, and you're about to live every second of it. Prisoners in medieval dungeons often subsisted on a diet of rancid gruel, a mainstream historical fact. Records from 14th century London show that inmates received 2 messes of thin oat porridge per day, sometimes mixed with water from rain-collected barrels. It was less a meal and more an edible apology. As you trudge across uneven stone, you almost slip on a slick patch of moss that thrives here thanks to constant drips. You glance down to see a half-eaten hunk of coarse rye bread, blackened at the edges. Some inmates tried to soften their daily ration by soaking it in water. Then wiping off the worst bits of fringe tidbits suggests that a few desperate souls even dipped their bread in guano-infused puddles to add protein, though historians still argue whether that story is medieval myth or documented survival tactic. You think, at least your instant noodles don't come with a side of cave slime. A single iron ring set low on the wall is chained to a length of rope with a rough-hewn wooden peg prisoner slept upright, propped against the wall, to avoid sliding into a pit of their own waste. Imagine nodding off mid-podcast and waking up face down in a toilet hole. Modern public restrooms look downright luxurious in comparison. Drudging boredom ruled here. With no books, no games, and no Wi-Fi, inmates often carved tally marks into the stone to count days. Archaeologists have unearthed walls covered in primitive calendar sand echo of your last attempt to track a Netflix series. The cell's only source of light is a narrow slit high above, through which you see a sliver of gray sky. Occasionally, a guard tosses down a scrap of paper, a crude note from a sympathetic visitor, a bribe offer, or a forgotten prayer. Fringe accounts claim that some prisoners managed to hoist small flags into that slit to signal allies outside. Historians still argue whether these escape aid flags ever succeeded, or simply added insult to injury. Visualize your worst email spam folder and multiply by 1,000. Your stomach growls, reminding you that all you've consumed would barely slake a mouse's appetite. You crouch to inspect a wooden bowl cracked along the rim. Stiff chunks of porridge cling to the sides like uninvited barnacles. You scrape at the residue with a chipped spoon, tasting a faint tang of fermentation. You wonder if it's improved with time or simply rotted into a new horror. The daily grind of this menu fosters a surprising commodity: hope. Some prisoners bartered extra morsels for a chance to wash in a shallow puddle near the entrance. Though fresh water was rationed like medieval cryptocurrency, boredom seeps into every crevice. To pass the endless hours, inmates sometimes attempted rudimentary card games using scraps of wood, scratched with suits and numbers. A quirky image. Prisoners huddled around a tattered deck, betting scraps of bread on who could remember the highest card. Historians still argue whether such makeshift games were widespread or merely romanticized by later storytellers. Regardless, your daily Sudoku puzzle feels downright archipelago compared to this prison poker. Rats skitter across the floor the moment your lantern flickers. The scuttling mass is often more rodents than humans in these cells gnawed at straw bedding, stole crumbs, and sometimes bit sleeping captives. Fringe tales tell of a particularly bold rat that stole a handkerchief from an inmate and dragged it beneath the wall. Some claim it was the dungeon's unofficial mailman. Historians still argue whether rats were organized bandits or random scavengers. You shiver, imagining your socks vanishing mid-dream. Lean in and inhale. The scent here is an unholy fusion of moldy straw, sour oats, and animal musk like a repurposed barn that hosted a decade-long food festival. Sanitation was optional. Waste pits, if present, were rarely cleaned more than once a month. Guards used long hooks to push human refuse into gutter sand, early calling for hazardous waste management. You can almost hear today's environmental regulators faint. Time loses meaning. Morning could be noon or midnight. The only rhythm is the guard's footsteps echoing in the corridor above. Some prisoners counted the clank of keys to gauge shifts, whispering, 10 steps means breakfast, 20 steps means torture, though actual meal times were notoriously unpredictable. Fringe records mention a prisoner who meticulously mapped guard patrols in coded symbols on the wall. Historians still argue whether this dungeon cartography ever led to a successful escape or merely secured posthumous fame. Occasionally, a priest might descend to deliver last rites or hear confessions. The sound of his trembling chant, muffled by stone arches, offered flickers of solace. Many captives clung to faith as their only comfort. Some carved crosses over their shackles, hoping divine intervention would swing open those iron doors. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval churches often lobbied for better treatment of prisoners, though success varied by region. Yet stone faith rarely filled an empty belly. At the back of the cell, you notice faint scorch marks where a tiny brazier once stood. Guards burned bits of coal to warn off the dampest cold, but fumes choked inhabitants. Fringe gossip says that some captives brewed a sort of crude tea from burnt coal ash and water. Historians still argue whether any survived the poison or simply perished slower. It's the medieval version of drinking coffee to stay awake, with less caffeine and more carbon. You lie back against the rough wall and feel the weight of exhaustion creep in. Your eyelids droop despite the cold. You think of your cozy bed at home and that soft mattress now, a memory as foreign as a spaceship landing in a village green. Every twitch of your muscles is a reminder of discomfort. Every shift risks slipping into a latrine hole. You can almost hear your own complaints echoing, "I miss my pillow." Strange solidarity forms among prisoners. Inmates exchanged gossip about events above ground. A wedding feast in the Great Hall, a siege rumor, or the latest plague outbreak destroying villages. That connection to outside news became currency, more valuable than a crust of bread. A quirky anecdote records captives organizing impromptu lecture circles, reciting bits of scripture or poetry to stave off mental collapse. Historians still argue whether these were genuine educational efforts or acts of collective hallucination. Despite the misery, some found ways to assert small freedoms. One prisoner, according to a fragmentary ledger, created a rudimentary sundial from shards of pottery and straw, tracking the sun's arc through the slit window. It was a tip of the hat to hope itself a clever defiance in a place meant to strip identity. You feel a stirring of respect for that inventor. Your latest DIY project suddenly seems trivial. Eventually, hunger and monotony blur into one. You rise, feet aching, and walk to the cell's entrance. Beyond lies the bustling corridor where guards trade gossip, clatter keys, and lock away fresh newcomers. For a moment, you consider calling out, "Change my meal plan," but swallow the thought. Instead, you prepare to move on to the next chamber, wondering what fresh torment awaits. You cast one last glance at the cell's interior. Chiseled tally marks, straw bedding, and the ghostly scratch of an escaped rat. This is daily life behind bars, unyielding discomfort, surreal boredom, and the odd flicker of defiance. As you step forward, you carry with you the echo of clinking chains and the memory of rancid gruel. Tomorrow, you'll find out what horrors lie in the torture chamber sore, maybe just more rats. Either way, the story trudges on. You emerge from the cramped, echoing corridor of standard cells into a chamber that feels purpose-built for shattering souls rather than merely containing bodies. Remember the dank straw bedding from Section 5? Now you're in the realm of deliberate terror, where every stone seems designed to amplify screams. Medieval castles often housed separate torture chambers, distinct from ordinary prison cells, to enforce confessions or punish the most worthy of torment. This separation became common by the 13th century as legal systems grew more centralized, a mainstream historical fact. The air here is hotter. Heavier, no gentle drafts or narrow slits to soothe the lungs. You can almost hear the hiss of leather straps rubbing against steel, a sound that would have unsettled even the most hardened knight. Standard prison cells prioritized containment and long-term misery. Torture chambers prioritized immediate psychological impact. While cells offered rancid gruel and rat-infested boredom, torture rooms offered vivid sensory assaults. The screech of wheels, the thud of iron boots, the drip of water at irregular intervals. To your right, a heavy wooden rack dominates the space. Two rollers bridged by taut ropes. The rack appears almost mocking in its simplicity, promising slow, systematic stretching of limbs. Invented in the late 13th century and famously used in the Tower of London, the rack underscores a fringe tidbit. Some gentry prisoners were reportedly given padded collars to reduce neck injuries, as lords still argued that broken bones devalued their property. Historians still argue whether those collars were practical concessions or merely rumor meant to humanize tyrants. Along one wall, iron rings set into stone suggest devices for strappado, where captives were hoisted by their wrists. The dropped weight of legs pulling downward could dislocate shoulders within moments. Contrast that with standard cells, where chains and shackles kept you barely mobile but left your body intact for extended torture by time and filth. Here, agony was deliberate and immediate. There was no hope of falling asleep upright to avoid waste pits. The chamber's floors are bare stone, worn smooth by countless steps and splattered with dark stains that might be rust or old dye from interrogation cloths. You notice a slight incline toward a central drain, likely intended to wash away blood or spilled wine from feasts above another modern aside. Nobody ever visited for wine here, not unless they were carrying buckets. A quirky anecdote claims that some inquisitors stained the floor with wine to disguise blood, staging more dramatic scenes for visiting dignitaries. Historians still argue whether this was theatrics or genuine sanitation. Flickering torches and sconces cast looming shadows of the rack onto the walls, creating monstrous silhouettes that danced as if alive. Unlike the faint daylight glimpsed through cell slits, this lighting was orchestrated to disorient captives' torchlight angles shifted unpredictably, making the chamber feel larger and more menacing. Some fringe sources suggest inquisitors used mirror arrays to blind victims briefly. Whether mirrors ever featured in medieval torture remains a point historians still argue. You run a tentative finger along the cold handle of a wheel, contraption likely a breaking wheel, though some argue those were reserved for public executions rather than castle interiors. The wheel's wooden spokes are gouged and worn, the metal rim pitted with rust. A local legend whispers of a noblewoman who was sentenced to the wheel but spared at the last minute. Instead, she endured weeks of solitary confinement in these cells. Historians still debate whether her fate was legend or the result of behind-the-scenes bribes. Opposite the rack sits a narrow, dark recess where a water torture device might have been anchored. Shallow basins carved into stone once directed drips onto bound foreheads, a method known as water torture, intended to induce panic rather than physical harm. You watch the patterns your lantern light casts across the basin's lip, imagining the slow, maddening rhythm of water drops. Unlike the one-off rack stretch, this drip method preyed on your mind no brute force required, just patient cruelty. On a low bench stained black, you spot faded scorch marks evidence of an iron brand used to mark criminals or dissenters. Branding irons were heated in braziers and seared onto skin, leaving permanent reminders of authority. Standard cells never bore such marks. Here, mutilation and memory melded into a single ordeal. A fringe tidbit suggests some captives attempted to bargain for cooler branding irons filled with wine-soaked cloth to minimize burns of practice. Historians still argue existed or was purely mythical. The walls bear inscriptions in different hands, crude pleas scraped into the stone. "My lord, mercy," one reads. "I am not a heretic," another. A third jagged and barely legible declares, "They lie." These messages differ from the neat tally marks in cells. They are urgent, frantic, carved by those who faced immediate extremity of pain. You trace the gouges with your fingertip, noting how some letters sink deeper, as if carved with greater force born of desperation. In the corner stands a simple stool with an iron ring at its seat likely used for thumbscrews or leg vises. The stool's backrest is angled slightly, forcing captives into uncomfortable postures that pre-stress joints. Standard cells might do the same with wooden benches, but never with the express intent of fracturing limbs. The stool's positioning near the torch sconces ensured torturers could adjust light to spotlight each victim, amplifying the emotion of confession or plea. The ceiling here is unadorned rock, rough-hewn and unforgiving. No vaulted arches to distribute weight. Instead, beams of oak reinforce the top, spiked with iron to prevent collapse if a fortune teller trapped in the cell above kicked too hard. A quirky rumor asserts that some architects interwove bones from previous prisoners into these beams for extra strength and extra dread. Historians still argue whether bones ever made it into medieval mortar or if this is a later embellishment. You notice a small hatch in the floor. It leads to a pit used for secure storage of confessions once extracted. Scribes would lock prisoners in a side chamber until inked parchments were completed. The pit's walls bear scratches. Some say these were made by illiterate captives left alone too long. Others insist they served as tally holes for guard counts. Historians still debate the hatch's true purpose, as surviving records remain frustratingly vague. The room's temperature rises slightly at the far end where a brazier stands, cold now but once roaring with charcoal. The heat ensured straps and iron stayed red hot, cutting into flesh without warning. Yet torches were frequently doused before interrogations began to heighten shock when metal was introduced. Fringe accounts claim some inquisitors used scented oils on irons to mask the smell of burning flesh. Historians still argue if such perfuming was ever practiced or remained a vile rumor. You step carefully over a line in the stone flora boundary once marked the point beyond which guards interpreted movement as flight. Many intruders sometimes, even the Inquisitor's own assistants, misjudged that line and ended up the ones bound to the rack. Standard prison cells lacked such tripwires. Here, every inch of space was governed by silent rules of survival. Before you leave, you brush your hand against a piece of flaking plaster where someone once hung a holy icon, perhaps hoping divine presence might intervene. Even in sheer despair, captives sought comfort in faith, contrasting with the stark emptiness of regular cells. Torture chambers sometimes featured crude religious symbols, both tool of torment and token of hope. Scholars still argue whether church authorities encouraged their placement or if they were clandestine appeals by prisoners themselves. You take a final look at the room. Rack, stool, wheel impressions, and the drip basinal instruments fine-tuned to extract fear and compliance. Stepping back through the low doorway, you feel the chamber's weight linger in your bones. You're returning to the monotonous ache of standard cells, but now you carry the knowledge of instruments meant to break more than bodies, they broke wills. As you step into the corridor beyond, the silence feels heavier, as if the walls themselves are exhaling after the chamber's relentless tension. Tomorrow, you'll witness infamous medieval prisons, and the prisoners whose names still echo through history. But for now, you're grateful for the simpler misery of a cell over engineered cruelty. You emerge from the silent corridor into a grander, more notorious, real infamous medieval prisons whose very names still send shivers down your spine. First stop, London's Newgate Prison. You step beneath its arched gateway, recalling the dank straw and rancid gruel of Section 5. But here the stench has been refined by centuries of human misery. Newgate, founded in 1188 as part of the city's defensive wall, evolved into a sprawling complex by the 15th century of mainstream historical fact-housing thieves, debtors, and political dissidents in cramped cells and fetid yards. The courtyard before you brims with echoes of public hangings, where crowds once gathered for macabre entertainment. You imagine the roar of jeering Londoners hooded in wool and leather jackets, eager for spectacle. Modern asides drift through your mind. It's like a medieval football match, except the only goals ended lives. Behind you, a weathered stone bears a shallow carving. Jack Shepherd, 1724, a robber, turned legend who tunneled out of Newgatian audacious escape that turned him into a folk hero. Fringe tidbit. Some storytellers claim he bribed a prison cat to smuggle in his lockpicks, though historians still argue whether any feline accomplices actually existed. You trudge past narrow, iron-barred windows that gape like dead eyes. Inside, the light is a pale smear across damp walls. The cells are so small you can stretch your arms and touch both opposite walls at once. This is no architectural accident. By the 16th century, space in Newgate's debtors' tower had dwindled so dramatically that prisoners often slept in shifts, using a single straw pallet between them. A quirky tidbit. One debtor allegedly paid to sleep on the roof, exposed to rain and wind, just to escape the day shift. Historians still argue whether roof permits were sold officially or emerged as a black market privilege. Moving deeper, you pass the condemned cell, where the air feels strangely cooler-like, opening a fridge after steaming in a sauna. Executed prisoners were held here until the scaffold's platform was raised, their final prayers swallowed by stone walls. You might imagine yourself pacing back and forth, counting cells rather than days, rehearsing that last plea for mercy. In contrast to ordinary dungeon cells, this space was reserved strictly for those at death's door rather than long-term sufferers. From Newgate, You traverse time and space to Paris's Bastille, originally built in 1370 as part of Charles V's defensive fortifications. Once a formidable fortress, by the 17th century, it became a state prison, infamous for housing political prisoners, under lettres de cachet warrants, ordering secret imprisonment. That's a mainstream fact. You could disappear without trial at the king's whim. You step past thick walls punctuated by arrow slits, recalling Section 4's vaulted arches. But here the stones are darker, dampened by the Seine's mists. In one turret cell, you see patched walls and shallow niches, remnants of the solitary confinement once endured by Francois Calas, accused of murdering his son in a case that exposed religious intolerance in 1762. Fringe scholars whisper that he carved Latin prayers into his walls. Others argue these were later additions by sympathetic guards. Historians still argue whether his inscriptions were authentic or the product of posthumous propaganda campaigns. You squint through barred windows at a sliver of sky. The chill you feel here bites deeper than any draft in a standard cell, as if the Bastille itself resented your curiosity. Below you, a narrow stone ledge once served as a seat. The prisoner would perch there, shoulders hunched, knees drawn au pain. Involuntary fetal position meant to break both body and spirit. It's a violent contrast to the more communal misery of Newgate's debtor wards. A modern aside crosses your mind. This is like an escape room gone terribly wrong, where every puzzle is designed to crush hope. In that spirit, you spot a faint inscription, Sans Retour, without return, crudely scratched into the sill by a desperate hand. A quirky rumor contends that some prisoners fashion tiny flags to wave at passing guards, begging for food behavior sometimes met with laughter rather than mercy. Historians still argue whether any such flag-bearing captives elicited compassion or only derision. Wandering into the Bastille's lower casemates, you step onto a stone floor so cold you feel it in your teeth. These cells once held high-profile figures Émile Zola's enemies, Huguenot preachers, and even the writer Voltaire's rival, the Chevalier de Rohan, who memorably painted the Bastille as the key to Venice, though he never set foot there. A fringe tidbit suggests he bribed a jailer to bring him theater scripts, which he performed for fellow inmates. Historians still argue whether these clandestine performances actually occurred or were invented to spice memoirs. You pause before the little tower, the Bastille's most notorious dungeon. Its walls are 3 feet thick, and the single-barred porthole sits so high that no one could see out. It was here that the Marquis de Sade purportedly languished for 2 years, living mostly in darkness on early study of sensory deprivation, some might say. A mainstream fact, the Marquis' lengthy imprisonment underscored the power of lettres de cachet over law. Yet fringe tales claim he held secret salon discussions by candlelight, entertaining cellmates with scandalous prose. Historians still argue whether any such gatherings were recorded or later invented to enhance his legend. As you retrace your steps toward the exit, you sense the weight of these infamous prisons pressing on your shoulders as heavily as the dungeon stones themselves. Newgate and the Bastille share a lineage of secrecy and suffering, yet they differ in scale and social cachet. Newgate's chaos accommodated every rung of criminality. The Bastille's selective indignity targeted those whose status clashed with royal prerogative. Across Europe, other lairs lurked. Italy's Mamertine prison, beneath Rome's Forum. Spain's Castillo de San Jorge, rumored to host the Inquisition's darkest deeds. And the Tower of London, whose crypts held everyone from Anne Boleyn to Guy Fawkes. Fringe records speak of secret tunnels linking these infamous sites, a Robin Hood-style network, though historians still argue whether any such labyrinth truly existed or simply fired romantic imaginations. You step back into the courtyard's gray light, the echoes of clinking chains and whispered confessions fading behind you. The shadow of the gateway stretches across the cobblestones, reminding you that these walls once held lives in their palm. You breathe in the cold air, curious whether your lungs have absorbed some fragment of that centuries-old confinement. As you prepare to move on, you can't help but respect the resilience of those who endured these legendary prisons. They survived more than physical walls. They faced bureaucratic nightmares, social erasure, and the ever-present possibility of being forgotten. And now, you bear witness to their stories, uncomfortable, haunting, yet undeniably compelling. Ahead lies tales of daring jailbreaks and whispered legends that still ignite scholarly debate. But for now, you pause in the dim courtyard of history's most infamous dungeons, feeling the weight of every barred cell and secret passage. You slip through a narrow archway lined with scorched, darkened stones. Remember those iron rings dangling in Section 4? And enter a twilight world of whispers and cunning plans. Throughout medieval Europe, prisoners famously orchestrated daring jailbreaks that defied both walls and guards. Take Jack Shepherd, the 18th century thief whose repeated escapes from Newgate turned him into a folk hero, a mainstream historical fact that still thrills storytellers today. In these dim passages, you sense the residue of ambition and desperation, like the faint echo of a smuggled pick scraping against iron bars. Your lantern's beam trembles over a half-buried tunnel entrance. Locals spoke of secret passages carved beneath fortress walls, linking dungeons to safe houses in nearby villages. Legend says Windsor Castle featured such a tunnel beneath its moat, though no definitive map survives. Historians still argue whether these subterranean routes ever reached more than a few yards, or if they're later embellishments by imaginative chroniclers. You lean close to the earth, breathing the damp, loamy scent of centuries-old soil, and wonder if you could follow its hidden veins to freedom. A rope slack on the floor catches your eye. Fringe rumor claims one prisoner slipped strands of linen sheets through a narrow window to lower himself into the gardens below. He then scaled the curtain wall, using a crude pulley system fashioned from a tavern spoon. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Escaping via borrowed cutlery sound familiar if you've ever tried prying open a stubborn jar lid at home. Yet, clever tools were key. Some captives sharpened bits of broken comb or nibs from quill pens to jimmy locks. Historians still argue whether these improvised devices truly bent metal or simply bolstered prisoners' morale. You follow the tunnel's gentle curve, brushing your fingertips along smooth, water-worn walls. The legend of the midnight laundry escape plays in your mind. A basket of soiled linens, smuggled into a cell by a sympathetic laundress, became the unwitting delivery system for hidden keys wrapped in cloth. The prisoner waited until moonlight touched the cobbles above, then retrieved his set, unlocked his shackles, and vanished into the night. Fringe accounts even credit laundry rats with ferrying messages, but skeptics and believers remain locked in debate. Ahead, a faint breeze whispers through a narrow gap in the stone. You recall the air shafts of Section 4, now repurposed in folklore as message tubes. Some tales insist that guards toss tools down these shafts, trusting prisoners to fashion their own liberation. Whether true or apocryphal, the image of a knight in shining armor guard inadvertently aiding an escape feels like medieval social media trolling. Historians still argue whether these shafts served purely for air or doubled as clandestine supply lines. You step into a broader chamber where the floor dips toward a dry well. One eccentric legend speaks of a prisoner who bored through the well wall with a sharpened belt buckle, inch by inch, until he reached the open moat. With a final push, he slipped into the water, swam to the bank, and disappeared into the reeds. You test the well's edge cold and crumbly and shiver, debating whether you'd trust your life to such a gamble. Modern asides pop up. Would you share your escape live on social media for likes? Probably not. A distant drip echoes. The slow pulse of water torture from Section 6 still haunting these corridors. But here, the drip takes on new meaning. Prisoners allegedly used water to loosen mortar between stones, then chipped away at dawn. Rolling their bedsheets into ropes, they climbed to the surface, only to find themselves on a ledge hundreds of feet above ground. Some felt tragic casualties of genius, Fringe lore says a few survived by landing in haystacks laid beneath by co-conspirators, though historians still argue if those haystacks ever existed or were later romantic flourishes. You notice scratch marks on a low doorframe, evidence of frantic efforts to widen the gap. Beneath them, in rough Latin, someone once carved, Libertas aut mor, freedom or death. This stark motto captures the psyche of would-be escape artists who risked everything. In contrast to the slow, grinding agony of standard cells, these breakout attempts ignited hope and fear in equal measure. You run your hand over the inscription, feeling the ancient grooves like the press of a compass needle pointing toward freedom. A whisper of wind guides you to a hidden staircase spiraling upward. It's cramped. You must turn sideways to ascend, much like contorting yourself to squeeze through modern Instagram trends. You climb carefully, guided by the faint light filtering down from above. Each step feels worn by the feet of those who climbed to freedom and by those who fell short and never returned. Historians still argue whether this stair originally served as an escape route or was later adapted by prisoners desperate for an exit. At the stair's top, you emerge into an overgrown courtyard, moonlight filtering through the leaves. You stand where a prison break once culminated. Empty cell doors swinging on hinges, ropes frayed but still present, and a single slipper left behind like a macabre Cinderella token. A quirky tidbit claims that the slipper was found by a guard's daughter, who kept it as a keepsake. Historians still debate whether that child ever existed, or if the tale was invented to humanize a brutal system. You step away from the courtyard, your heart racing. In the hush, you can almost hear the cheers of local villagers who celebrated each successful breakout. The memory lingers, guards racing across battlements, lantern beams cutting through fog, and the thrill of witnessing someone defy walls built to last centuries. This is folklore woven into stona, tapestry of boldness and folly. As you retrace your path, you pass the sealed entrance once used by a famed Jesuit priest who smuggled himself out of the Bastille in the 17th century. He wore a plain cassock, blending with visiting clerics to slip past sentries. A mainstream fact notes that clerical garb offered occasional immunity, but fringe rumors suggest he carried a tiny flute to mimic guard whistles. Historians still argue whether such musical subterfuge aided his escape, or whether the story emerged from post-revolution gossip. Back in the tunnel, you pause, sensing the weight of myth and reality entwined. Each chiseled mark, each whispered rumor, each vanished stone reminds you how human ingenuity and hope persist even in the darkest places. These legends, some verified, others fantastical, speak to a universal urge to break free from constraint. You imagine yourself racing through these corridors, heart pounding, every stone both obstacle and ally. Finally, you emerge into fresh air once more, just as the first bird song of dawn stirs the sleeping landscape. The cool morning breeze feels like redemption. You glance back at the hidden archway, now silent and seemingly ordinary, hiding centuries of secret slips to liberty. The legends remain, half-truths and tall tales woven by those desperate to taste freedom. You step onto grassy earth, your boots sinking slightly into the damp turf. Above you, the ruins of the castle loom a silent witness to countless escape bids. You shiver, not from cold, but from awe at the lengths people would go to evade these hellish cells. The whisper of folklore follows you as you walk away, a reminder that hope can carve tunnels through even the thickest walls. You step into a low, narrow chamber where the flicker of your lantern reveals rows of earthenware bowls set on a rough-hewn shelf. Remember the moldy straw and rancid gruel we smelled back in Section 5? Here, diet and disease intersect in the most dismal way. By the 14th century, prison regulations in England mandated a daily ration of bread and small beer or weak ale for inmatessa. Mainstream historical fact recorded in the statutes of King Edward III. That small beer was safer to drink than stagnant well water, though its alcohol content was so low it might have held off dehydration more than thirst. You pop the cork of an imaginary pint and wince. At least your favorite IPA carries more flavor. As you trudge forward, your boots splash through a shallow puddle of stale water pooled on the floor, perhaps carried in from Section 4's drainage gutters, or tracked in by rats, those ever-present roommates from Section 5. The puddle's surface shimmers with what looks like oil, though it's probably just mineral runoff mixed with mold spores. Fringe rumors claim prisoners sometimes brewed this slime into a crude healing salve, for their source historians still argue whether any therapeutic benefits outweighed the risk of gangrene. You squint at the surface, imagining your TikTok DIY fails if you tried that at home. You spot a wooden table scarred with knife marks, where guards once cut large loaves into slices. The coarse rye or barley bread often contained bits of chaff, burnt crusts, and occasionally, live insects. Some records note that guards intentionally included these insects to discourage loaf theft talk about a bug bounty program gone wrong. A quirky detail. One 13th century account mentions a prisoner who kept a scalp acne habit of flicking beetles into a corner, training them like dungeon pets. Historians still argue whether he did this for companionship, or because boredom drives you to question basic sanity. Next to the bread shelf, you see a heavy iron pot where a thin pottage once simmered. Pottages were slow-cooked mixtures of grains, legumes, and whatever roots guards obtained. During lean times, pottage could be watered down so much it resembled lukewarm dishwater. Your morning coffee looks downright robust compared to that. Some sources note that prison herb garden small plots near castle kitchen supplied dandelion leaves or parsley to flavor meals. Fringe tales speak of prisoners stealing sprigs of mint for dungeon mojitos, though historians still argue whether any mint survived the journey from garden to plate. You lift your lantern to reveal a small wooden crate tucked beneath the table. Inside, shards of pottery bottles once held crude medicinal concoctions, vinegar infused with herbs, honey mixed with mustard seeds, and, in a particularly curious case, pulverized goose fat blended with rosemary oil. Medieval medical texts recommended such remedies for crowding-related ailments like scurvy and dysentery, mainstream fact drawn from monastic infirmary records. You sniff the empty bottleneck and wrinkle your nose. Goose fat had a shelf life shorter than your last phone battery. Disease was the real scourge. In the cramped, damp air of a dungeon, infections spread faster than gossip in an online comment section. Bubonic plague outbreaks of the mid-14th century penetrated prison walls, turning cells into pestilent incubators. Contemporary chronicles report that Newgate's death rate soared by over 50% during the Black Death, a grim statistic. Fringe lore includes tales of prisoners crafting rat masks from scraps of cloth to ward off fleas. Historians still argue whether any such masks truly reduced plague risk or simply made inmates look like medieval cosplayers. Your shoulder brushes a damp wall where mold has grown in splotchy clusters. Moldy bread, moldy cell walls, moldy everything. Fungal infections were rampant. Some captives rubbed their sores with moldy bread paste, hoping for healing. Others blamed fungi for hallucinations and night terrors. Modern asides flit through your head. If you thought your last penicillin prescription was complicated, imagine sourcing it from prison fungus. You shuffle further into the chamber and notice iron ring bolts set a foot above the floor attachments for restraining prisoners during plague outbreaks. The idea was to isolate the sick in separate cells, though poorly ventilated dungeons likely worsened conditions. A quirky anecdote claims one warden tried isolating a leper by sealing him in a barrel with breathing holes drilled in the lid. Historians still argue whether this barrel quarantine ever occurred or stands as apocryphal. Cruelty. On a narrow shelf above a latrine pit, you spy broken glass vials that once contained laudanum, a tincture of opium used to dull pain. A mainstream fact. Laudanum became widespread in the 16th century, so early prison records from the 15th century don't mention it. Yet fringe scholars insist that daring jailers smuggled opium from eastern trade routes as early as the 1400s. Historians still argue whether any inmate ever slept through the cold night without nightmare-laced twisted dreams. You taste a dry speck of what might be salt or dried pottage residue on a chipped spoon found next to a shredded cloth bag. Salt was precious, and guards sometimes rationed it so strictly that prisoners developed malnutrition symptoms, lethargy, cramps, and brittle hair. Recorded evidence from 14th century French jails describes prisoners suffering scurvy-like symptoms: gums, bleeding, teeth loosening as they clawed at cell walls. A fringe tale says one detainee chewed on his own leather sandal to extract salts. Historians still argue whether any courage emerges from chewing straps or just more blisters. As you turn to leave, your eye catches a slender scroll wedged between stones. It's a recipe for prisoner's broth: water, bits of stale bread, handfuls of wild garlic, and a sprig of yew, leaves a herb known both for medicinal and poisonous qualities. Some believed yew cured fevers. Others knew it could kill within hours. Fringe accounts credit herbalist prisoners with devising this lethal cure-or-kill brew. Historians still argue whether they ever tested it on fellow inmates or kept it as a desperate bluff. You step back into the corridor, mind reeling from the intersection of diet and disease. Here, meals were not nourishment but tokens of power. The difference between life and death, health and plague. In this chamber, every crumb held consequences. Every scrap might be tainted, and every drop of liquid could harbor infection or remedy. As you trudge onward, you carry the lingering tastes and smells of medieval prison cuisinia. Banquet of sorrow and survival. Ahead, status-determined fate. Whether you received extra rations or extra shackles. But for now, you've tasted the grim reality of prisoner diets and diseases that turned hope into hopelessness. And as you leave the bowls behind, the distant echo of coughing and clinking bowls reminds you that food and illness were as formidable adversaries as iron bars. You step into two adjacent chambers, barely a stone's throw apart, yet worlds apart in terms of comfort. Remember the rancid gruel and sodden straw of Section 5? Now imagine the opposite end of that misery index. In late medieval Europe, your social rank often determined whether you endured a damp cell or a cushioned corner tawera mainstream historical fact. By the 14th century, highborn captives awaiting ransom were frequently housed in castle keeps with straw mattresses, fire-heated chambers, and meat-rich diets, while peasants languished below on icy stone floors and breadwater. In the first room, you sink onto a pile of fresh hay, surprisingly soft beneath your fingertips. The sweet scent of dried grass wafts up almost like a farmer's market, minus the smiling vendors. A low-burning brazier crackles in the corner, its warmth a stark contrast to the freezing cells you toured earlier. You run your hand over a folded fur cloak draped across a wooden chest. Rumor has it that Queen Eleanor once sent this very cloak to calm a tearful hostagine anecdote some claim inspired medieval teddy bears. Historians still argue whether this gift was genuine compassion or merely diplomatic theater. Your stomach rumbles as a footman you didn't know was standing by places a bowl of thick venison stew on a small oak table. The rich aroma of herbs, rosemary, and thyme fills the torchlit room, making your taste buds ache. You dip in a wooden spoon and taste tender meat that practically falls off the bone. Fringe tidbit. One noble prisoner allegedly kept a pet magpie to catch scraps of stew and entertain him with mimicry. Historians still argue whether any feathered jesters thrived in dungeons, or if the tale is court gossip amplified by bards. Across the hall, you squeeze into a narrow, shadowed cell where a single lump of coarse rye dough serves as both bed and meal. The air here is colder, thicker, and tinged with mildew deftly contrasted by the honeyed perfume of the noble's stew room. You brush frost from the stone windowsill and shiver, wondering if your modern heated mattress topper could reach these depths. A quip crosses your mind. I'd trade my smartphone for a slice of that bread, though the historical peasant probably would have traded his smartphone for anything edible. The stark divide stems from the feudal system. Nobles were pawns in ransom negotiations, their captors motivated by profit. Peasants were usually jailed as punishment, with no hope of a hefty ransom. One mainstream fact notes that King Edward I's soldiers ransomed dozens of captured French knights at Agincourt, filling English coffers, whereas common soldiers pressed into service ended up rotting in clinking chains. Imagine complaining about a prison Wi-Fi being down. These peasants didn't even get a crumb of bread. Drifting back to the noble chamber, you notice an alcove holding leather-bound books, Latin scriptures, and chivalric romances. The cracked spines suggest frequent reading to pass time. Fringe rumor holds that some nobles gambled on dice games played with ivory cube sets, smuggled in by sympathetic servants. Historians still argue whether ivory dice were common contraband or mere legend. You smile at the idea of high-born guests playing medieval backgammon, complete with whispered bets in the candlelight. In stark contrast, the peasant cell bears no evidence of leisure. The walls are scrawled with terse curses and tally marks chipped deep, an anonymous graffiti gallery of despair. No straw bedding here, just a thin layer of sawdust that shifts coldly underfoot. A single iron ring juts from the wall, its chain frayed and wet from condensation. You peek through a barred slit and catch a glimpse of squash-colored dawn breaking over the moor, yet you'd never feel that sunrise from inside. Moving back to the noble quarters, you sip a small goblet of sweet wine delivered by a hushed attendant. The taste of oak and fruit warms your throat. Nearby, a tapestry depicting a tournament scene drapes a section of wall, hiding a crack in the stony combination of propaganda and insulation. Fringe anecdote. One baron held a jousting tourney in the courtyard of his own prison to entertain captive vassals, complete with bets on their prowess. Historians still argue whether such festivities were acts of mercy or hubristic cruelty. A subtle click echoes as you lift a wooden panel in the noble room, revealing a stash of letters sealed with wax messages from family, offering condolences and requesting updated ransom amounts. You imagine slipping these into your pocket like modern express mail. Meanwhile, the peasants on the other side might receive scraps of gossip scrawled in, charcoal barely legible, and long after the news would have mattered. This communication gap sharpened feelings of isolation, a social experiment with zero ethics committee oversight. You pause to roll your shoulders, adjusting to two very different atmospheres. One filled with warmth, aromatic herbs, and soft textiles. The other cold, damp, and barren. It's like comparing a five-star resort suite to a budget hostel hallway, except both built atop dripping stone. A modern comparison drifts into your mind. One cell got room service, the other got no service. As you move between the chambers, you notice the guards themselves behave differently. The soldier overseeing the noble's room bows deeply and treads lightly, offering polite salutations and prompts for wine refills. Yet the guard rattling the prisoner locks on the peasant's cell barely spares a nod. He tosses the keychain without looking, likely frustrated by the sheer number of low-status bodies. Fringe sources whisper some guards accepted bribes for tighter shackles. Historians still argue whether those bribes bought comfort or simply delayed beatings. Sound carries oddly here. In the noble room, you barely hear the distant clang of dungeon gates. In the peasant cell, every echo magnifies tenfold. A laugh here could be mistaken for a scream there. In the noble chamber, soft music sometimes drifted upalut, a harp arranged by captors hoping to improve their captive's mood or image. In the peasant's world, the only music was the drip of water, the scurry of rats, and the occasional hoot of an owl. You settle into the noble's padded bench and appreciate the silence, broken only by distant footsteps. Luxury indeed. Yet, even in comfort, the noble's captivity was a psychological torment. Surrounded by reminders of privilege, lost books, tapestries, fine linens, a captive felt the sting of dependency every waking moment. Historians still argue whether these luxuries were acts of flattery or of cruelty, designed to mock the former glories of aristocracy. You briefly close your eyes, imagining the world beyond the walls. Banquets, courtly dances, fields of grain of life paused indefinitely. In the peasant cell, you lean against the cold wall and glance at deep gouges, names and dates of fellow commoners who waited years for release, sometimes dying before trial. Their only solace lay in forging camaraderie with cellmates, sharing morsels, slipping notes, whispering prayers. A fringe tidbit recalls a peasant uprising where jailed farmers staged a sit-in, refusing to leave, until authorities promised fair trials. Historians still argue whether that protest succeeded or simply ended with more bodies in the dungeon. As you prepare to move on, you take one last look at both rooms. Status determined not just your bed and your bread, but the very architecture around you. One had vaulted ceilings, the other low arches that made you hunch. One smelled of lavender oil, the other of mold and misery. One echoed with polite knocks, the other permeated silence broken only by you, an outsider in a world of enforced separation. You step back into the corridor that links these disparate fates. Your footsteps resonate differently now. One soft thud on carpeted hay, one hollow clang on cold stone. The contrast lingers in your mind as you trudge toward the next section, the overlooked stories of women and children in dungeons. But before you go, you can't help but reflect. In the Middle Ages, your social rank was as binding as iron manacles, a cruel reminder that freedom and suffering were commodities traded by status. You trudge down the same damp corridor that separated noble bliss from peasant despair in Section 10. But here the stakes shift from social rank to age and gender. In the Middle Ages, women and children were often lumped into the general prison population, despite growing calls for separate wards, a mainstream historical fact. By the early 14th century, London's Newgate established a female ward behind the sheriff's keeper's quarters, though overcrowding often rendered the separation moot. You shiver as the torchlight flickers across a heavy oak door emblazoned with a barely legible W, and wonder how many mothers hesitated before stepping inside. As you push the door open, you're met with a blast of cold that feels like an unwelcome hug. The ceiling here is slightly lower, as if the masons intended to keep occupants permanently bowed, an architectural afterthought that doubled as psychological intimidation. The space smells of damp wool, petticoats, and stale milk remnants of children's bottles left behind. You catch sight of carved initials high on the wall. AM 1297. No age noted, suggesting the anonymous carver assumed you'd know whether AM was 12 or 32. In this ward, mothers shackled to infant cradles were not uncommon. Records from 15th century Paris recount at least one woman jailed for debt who gave birth chained to a pillar, her cries echoing through the fortress, an image that would upset any modern parenting forum. Fringe rumors claim she soothed her child with lullabies in Latin, trusting in clerical mercy. Historians still argue whether that tale is penitential legend or archival fact. You cringe at the thought of diaper changing under iron shackles, no Pampers in sight. A narrow slit window, too high for a child to peek through unaided, bathes the room in pale light. It casts long shadows across a small hearth where a single iron kettle once boiled watery broth for the entire ward. You imagine 10 children clustered around that pot, waiting their turn like medieval line dancers, except the only tune was the scrape of spoon on pot. One quirky anecdote suggests a resourceful young girl dyed onion skins into crude crayons and sketched secret messages in the pseudo-primitive version of bathroom graffiti. Historians still argue whether these drawings encoded escape plans or simply recorded the menu. To your left, a makeshift cradly wooden plank slung from iron chain shangs above a fetid latrine pit. Mothers used the plank to rock infants, hoping the motion would induce sleep rather than claustrophobia. A fringe story claims some infants grew so accustomed to the sway they tried to keep the chains moving even when guards unlatched the babies. Historians still debate if this was cunning mimicry or desperate comfort-seeking. You half expect a medieval baby to deliver its own stand-up comedy routine. How many guards does it take to change a diaper? Spoiler, a lot. You step over scattered straw and broken wooden dolls carved by older siblings. Children arrested for petty theft or conscription into armies as young as 9 sometimes found themselves here. It's a mainstream historical fact that individuals under 7 were technically exempt from criminal punishment under canon law, but older children, some as young as 10, could be tried and jailed. You can almost hear the echoes of hushed sobs and childish giggles twisted by fear. A chilling lullaby that would haunt any nursery rhyme. At the far end, a narrow alcove serves as a courtroom for summary adjudications guards, tried petty cases without leaving the dungeon, pronouncing judgments from a wooden stool. One quirky detail notes that in some German castles, female prisoners could appeal to an abbess at a nearby convent, which provided marginally better conditions. Fringe accounts speak of nuns secretly sewing quilts for imprisoned women. Historians still argue whether these convent appeals were genuine humanitarian efforts or a means to remove inconvenient inmates from public view. You tap your finger on the stool, imagining the blunt verdicts: guilty pay fine or stay forever. The cell's door bears a patched wooden board narrowing the entrance designed, you suspect, to keep guards from entering the ward too casually and being confronted by furious mothers. Yet that same board trapped children inside with minimal supervision. A mainstream record from a 14th century English jail notes a guard who was reprimanded for letting a boy escape through a window because he simply forgot the board in place after unlocking his own midday nap. You smirk at the idea of a medieval guard snoozing on duty. Security standards have changed, but naps remain irresistible. You notice slender iron pins hammered into the wall at varying heights, rest points for cradles of different sizes. Each pin shows wear from ropes that once held wicker baskets, now long rotted away. A fringed tale suggests one ingenious mother braided her hair into the ropes so guards wouldn't distinguish her from her child in low light, a desperate camouflage tactic. Historians still argue whether such braided deceptions ever saved lives or only added tragic confusion. A tiny altar carved into a wall niche holds chipped pottery cups once used for communion. Clergy sometimes ventured here to baptize infants born in captivity, or to offer last rites to children who succumbed to disease, a mainstream fact recorded in bishops' registers. Yet church records often omitted the names of the youngest souls, regarding them as little lambs whose fates were no longer subject to earthly justice. You brush soot from the niche and whisper a silent hope that some peace reached these small spirits. Against one wall lean crude peg dolls, carved from scrap wood. They lack arms or legs, mere rounded figures meant to distract a child's mind for a moment. One fringe manuscript entry claims prisoners fashioned marionettes from torn cloth and bone fragments, staging puppet shows to entertain audiences of 1 or 2 children. Historians still debate whether these performances ever occurred or were later romanticized in court chronicles. You imagine a medieval toddler offering critique. Too scary, mama. You trudge past a low stone bench where older girls sat knitting coarse caps from leftover rope or twine. Knitting in dungeons dates back to the 12th century, but female prisoners reportedly used coded patterns to transmit messages like secret Morse code in wool. A quirky detail: certain stitch sequences corresponded to letters, enabling disguised communication between cells. Historians still argue whether these knitted missives truly facilitated escapes or simply bolstered morale. You finger the bench's smooth groove and wonder if today's text messages lack the tactile comfort of hand-knit secrecy. Near the door, a small barrel organ once stood, donated by a sympathetic merchant to calm restless inmates. Toy instruments were sometimes allowed in children's wards. Fringe reports mention a young boy who taught himself tunes, playing lullabies on a half-decayed barrel organ to soothe frightened siblings. Historians still argue whether such child musicians really existed or were poetic inventions by later storytellers. You hum a quiet tune, imagining how absurd it would be to request a TikTok duet from a dungeon. A distant drip echoes from the torture chamber you visited back in Section 6, the harsh reminder that these mothers and children were ever at risk of the same cruelties as adult male prisoners. Yet their suffering went largely unrecorded. Medieval scribes often prioritized property crimes over domestic tragedies. It's a mainstream fact that only about 10% of surviving prison rolls mention female inmates, and even fewer note children. The rest vanish into anonymity, like URLs lost in the Wayback Machine. You step into a tiny exit corridor, lit by a single torch. Here, the stone floor transitions to smoother flagstones, as if marking your passage from the world of gendered neglect back to the main dungeon complex. You hesitate, remembering the warm comforts once afforded to nobles, the rack and drip basins of torture, and now these cramped wards of mother and child. It's a mosaic of medieval justice, fractured by bias and scant compassion. As you cross the threshold, you carry the echo of lullabies cut short, of tiny hands carving initials into stone, and of mothers who bore chains as easily as bellyweights. Their stories fragmentary, whispered, and debated remind you that behind every iron door was a person with a name, a child with a dream, and a voice that history almost forgot. You slip through a carved wooden door into the cool hush of a medieval church sanctuary. Remember that damp corridor and clank of chains in Section 11? And the contrast hits you like a waft of fresh linen. The air here smells of polished wood, burning incense, and beeswax can also welcome reprieve from the rat spice stench of the dungeon. By the 12th century, canon law granted fugitives up to 40 days of sanctuary within Church Walsa mainstream, historical fact allowing them to plead for mercy or negotiate terms before secular authorities could drag them back to cold. Echoing cells, your boots thud softly on flagstones worn smooth by generations of worshippers, a sensory relief from the rough-hewn dungeon stones, where every footstep scratched out a grim echo. You pause before the high altar, its marble surface gleaming under candlelight, and imagine yourself kneeling to beg for forgiveness, rather than staring at iron bars. Fringe rumors whisper that some crafty outlaws swapped plain cloaks for priestly vestments to extend their sanctuary indefinitely. Historians still argue whether such ecclesiastical cosplay was widespread or simply a colorful legend. Slowly, you trudge down the nave, passing rows of heavy pews that once held supplicants offering sanctuary seekers food, coins, and whispered prayers. A quirky anecdote suggests that sanctuary-bound criminals carved "Help Me" messages into pew ends, hidden beneath hymnal song early form of graffiti plea for assistance. Modern asides flicker through your mind. If only they'd had sticky notes and Twitter, those pleas might have gone viral. Candles flicker in sconces along the side aisles, their warm glow dancing across stained glass depictions of mercy and redemption. In one pane, you see a thief kneeling at Christ's feet, an illustration of divine pardon. Yet some panels show more ambiguous scenes. A heiress hiding behind a pillar while soldiers pound at the church door. Fringe scholars debate if those windows depict real sanctuary cases or mere moralistic allegory. Historians still argue whether medieval artisans recorded actual events or crafted cautionary tales of power's reach. You brush your fingers over the carved stone baptismal font, tracing the ornate fleur-de-lis that marks church authority. New arrivals to sanctuary often had to touch this font or leave a token sometimes. A shoe or a belt buckle toe signal their right to protection. One quirky tale tells of a desperate noblewoman ditching all her shoes at the church door to avoid being dragged out. Historians still argue whether that barefoot defiance actually happened or was born from moralistic storytelling. Soft chanting drifts from the choir loft above. A lullaby of Latin psalms that soothes your nerves more effectively than any medieval laudanum. You imagine those chants echoing around a fugitive's head, offering hope that redemption might be bought with a whispered prayer. Beneath the loft, a small alcove contains a stone bench where starving sanctuary seekers sometimes languished for days, surviving on alms dispensed by pious townsfolk. A mainstream historical fact. Charitable guilds and brotherhoods coordinated discreet donations to sustain these souls, ensuring they didn't starve before their plea reached a bishop's ear. You move toward the carved oak door. On the church's north side, the legendary sanctuary door. Its iron knocker still bears the shape of a hand, symbolizing mercy, Tapping it once signaled your plea, thrice, and the entire town heard of your plight. Fringe lore claims some townsfolk rigged the knocker to ring bells at sunset, turning every dusk into a communal reminder of the church's protective vow. Historians still argue whether that practice was real or a later embellishment by chroniclers. Beyond the door, vaulted ceilings rise high above your head, a deliberate reminder of divine oversight. Compare that to the low barrel vaults of the dungeon, Section 4, designed to press down on the skull. Here, the light filters through clerestory windows, painting the floor with colored patterns like benevolent jail bars of sunbeams. You pause to let a slanted ray of morning sun warm your cheek, a luxury unheard of in stone-cold cells. A fringe anecdote surfaces. Criminals on Sanctuary once hatched escape plans via secret tunnels dug beneath church floors, intended to ferry them to nearby woods. Whether these subterranean routes existed or were merely whispered suspicions remains in dispute. Historians still argue if any tunnel ever extended beyond a few paces. You lean down to examine a seam between flagstones, half expecting to find a hidden hinge. Above you, cluster lamps hang from wrought iron chains. Unlike the sputtering torches of the dungeon, their steady glow created an atmosphere of reverence rather than terror. Some clergy even used scented oils on the lamps rose or lavender to dispel any lingering odor of blood and fear. A quirky detail. One abbot reportedly mixed frankincense with rosewater to welcome sanctuary seekers, hoping to mask the damp chill of the crypt below. Historians still argue whether that aromatic hospitality was commonplace or an extravagant anomaly. You drift toward a carved choir stall inscribed with the names of prominent sanctuary patrons, local guildmasters, abbots, and bishops who guaranteed to oversee a fugitive's case. Their names stand in sharp contrast to the anonymous tally marks scratched into dungeon walls. Section 5, where ordinary criminals left no legacy. Each patron's seal on the stall served as a protective ward, invoking both spiritual and earthly intervention. Now you find a narrow staircase tucked behind a tapestry, descending to a small side chamber reserved for sanctuary papers. Clerks here recorded names, crimes, and pledges of good behavior. A mainstream fact. These registers survive in cathedral archives, offering rare glimpses of medieval justice mingled with mercy. Yet they often omit the more dramatic details, the whispered bribes, the midnight escapes. Fringe historians still debate whether scribes intentionally sanitized records to protect reputations or merely adhered to clerical decorum. You exit the side chamber into a peaceful cloister garden, its columns draped in ivy and its fountain burbling like laughter. Candles flicker in lanterns hung from trees, and potted lavender sends a soft fragrance through the air. You realize this garden was a refuge for sanctuary seekers, allowed short walks, provided they didn't leave holy ground. Imagine complaining today about your house arrest being too strict. These fugitives had a courtyard walled by priests, not bars. Finally, you step back through the sanctuary door, the echoes of chant and birdsong fading as you re-enter the shadowed corridor. The heavy church kiwanse entrusted to sanctuary seekers clink softly at your hip, a reminder of both divine mercy and human mercy's limits. Here, within these walls, hope was tangible. Beyond, punishment waited. As you close the door behind you, the scent of incense lingers in your nostrils, an olfactory echo of compassion's power. You trudge onward towards Section 13, where legal reforms and early reformatories began to challenge both the cruelty of dungeons and the capriciousness of sanctuary. But for now, you carry the memory of flickering candlelight, scented solace, and the fragile promise of protection in a world ruled by iron and law. You emerge into a surprisingly orderly chamber off the main dungeon corridor, the air scented with fresh parchment and ink. Remember the scented incense of the sanctuary in Section 12? Here, reformers trade the clank of chains for the scratch of quills on paper. Under Emperor Frederick II's Constitutions of Melfi, 1231, southern Italian jails became among the first in Europe to require monthly inspections standard rations, and written logs of every inmate, a mainstream historical fact that feels like the medieval equivalent of a bureaucratic selfie update. Your boots thump on polished flagstones rather than uneven dungeon slabs, and you nearly expect a town clerk to ask for your prison number before granting entry. Instead, you find a wooden desk piled with leather-bound registries, each page listing names, alleged crimes, and bail amounts. Guards in simple tunics hover nearby, ready to record any new arrival. Fringe rumor claims that some cagey jailers slipped coded messages into margin notes directions for freed men and women to flee town under cover of dark historians. Still argue whether these clandestine annotations were pragmatic dissent. Scribal daydreams. You lean forward to inspect a ledger titled Liber Carcerum, Book of Prisons. The handwriting is neat, the ink still glossy despite its centuries' rest and occupational hazard for anyone who's ever argued over handwritten lecture notes. Modern asides flicker through your mind. This is like complaining that your email inbox has too many old newsletters, except here one misplaced entry could cost a man his freedom. Nearby, a stern-faced official measures out grain and beans from ceramic jars marked daily ration. The Emperor's statutes mandated sufficient food, firewood for warmth, and clean water sorcessa revolutionary shift from vengeance-driven cages. This early welfare policy aimed not only to contain offenders, but to limit disease and malnutrition outbreaks. You almost thank them for finally addressing prison food complaints millennia before your last restaurant Yelp review. On the wall behind the desk, a mural depicts a hooded figure bearing scales and a quill, justice and record. It proclaims in faded Latin. Some fringe scholars suggest this clandestine symbol represented a mythical iron archivist, a ghostly overseer who ensured jailers complied with regulations. Historians still argue whether any spectral enforcer actually haunted these halls, or whether the image was propaganda to boost obedience. You peer at the figure, half expecting it to blink. A low table holds parchments rolled in bundles, one labeled Women and Children, another Debt Cases, and a third, Political Detainees. The mere categorization marks a sea change. No longer were all captives treated as interchangeable bodies of misery. Instead, medieval authorities experimented with sorting prisoners by offense severity and social status to administer more appropriate confinement. A quirky anecdote records that a certain magistrate tried color-coding prisoners' caps for easy identification: blue for debtors, green for thieves. Red for heretics, though. Historians still argue if that day-glow strategy ever saw the light of day, or was just a rumor with poor fashion sense. Your lantern's glow reflects off a polished metal scale on the desk, used to weigh coin payments for fines and bail. Under the constitutions, jailers had to record each transaction in triplicate. One for the prisoner, one for the Lord's treasury, and one for the Imperial Archive. This triple-entry bookkeeping resembles modern accounting software, with backup servers except medieval accountants wore tunics instead of hoodies. A mainstream fact notes that accurate financial records helped curb graft and bribery, laying groundwork for more transparent governance. You slide a ledger closed and notice a narrow hatch in the wall leading to a small side chamber. Inside, you find scribes copying legal codes from heavy folios, ensuring local statutes aligned with imperial mandates. Each copyist workbench holds quills from goose and swan, and scraps of parchment used for practice like medieval whiteboards, but without the dry erase marker smell. Fringe gossip claims that one particularly bored scribe wrote a satirical poem about the 1 millionth prisoner becoming jailer. Historians still argue whether this poem survives or was erased for offending bureaucratic sensibilities. Leaning against the opposite wall, you see a display of early torture receipts lists of instruments loaned out for interrogations, with columns for date, user, and whether metal parts were returned intact. Even in an age of cruelty, administrators wanted to track expensive equipment. It's a quirky tidbit that medieval torturers had to sign for their gear, like medieval monopolies get out of jail free, but far less fun. Historians still argue whether these receipts reduced unauthorized torture or merely documented it more thoroughly. At the far end of the room, an arbor with wooden benches offers a place for guided discussions. Reform-minded clerics and magistrates held weekly councils here, debating whether prisons should punish or rehabilitate. They read from newly translated penitential texts that advocated prayer, labor, and moral instruction over endless chains. One early proposal suggested teaching inmates basic trade shoe repair or candle making to ease their re-entry into society. Fringe accounts claim that some progressive wardens even hosted dungeon workshops to craft goods sold in marketplaces, though historians still argue whether these cottage industries were noble experiments or forced labor schemes. You inhale the mingled scents of beeswax, leather, and ink, a strangely comforting aroma far removed from the dung and damp you've grown accustomed to. The ambient hush is broken only by the soft shuffle of parchment and the occasional scratch of Quilla gentle ASMR moment compared to the clang of iron gates. A light joke flits through your mind. Finally, a tutorial in jail administration turns out Excel spreadsheets aren't so modern after all. Your gaze drifts to a pedestal where a small iron key is displayed under glass. It's labeled as one of the first standardized prison keys, crafted to fit all cells in the complex. This universal key design simplified jailers' work no more fumbling through racks of mismatched keys. A mainstream historical fact. Standardized locks and keys emerged in the late 13th century, influencing secure storage technologies for centuries. A quirky aside. One record complains that guards often lost the key in straw bedding. Historians still argue whether this was sabotage or mere carelessness. As you turn to leave, you notice a narrow corridor branching off toward a clean, well-lit hall lined with small individual rooms, surly houses of correction, where minor offenders performed regulated labor instead of languishing in dark cells. These proto-reformatories emphasize discipline through work, prayer, and instruction. A fringe tale suggests that inmates in these workshops sometimes held impromptu religious plays to entertain visiting nobles. Historians still debate whether such amateur productions were genuine morale boosters or just elaborate prisoner hazing. Stepping back into the main corridor, you carry the murmur of reformers' debates and the faint scratch of quills on parchment. The chamber's orderly atmosphere feels almost alien compared to the dank dungeons you visited. Yet here, the seeds of modern penology were sown. Regulated jailers, meticulous record-keeping, and an emerging belief that punishment could include rehabilitation. As you walk away, the distant echo of a guard's key bundle reminds you that even the harshest prisons bowed, however slightly, to the notion of mercy. You pause at the corridor's fork, choosing your path toward the next chapter on medieval art and literature's portrayals of these evolving prisons. But before you go, take a moment to appreciate this surprising chapter of legal innovation in the dark heart of medieval incarceration. A reminder that even the most iron-bound institutions can change, one parchment at a time. You wander down a torchlit corridor where crude graffiti gives way to meticulously carved reliefs. Remember the tally marks of Section 5 and the registry ledgers of Section 13? Now, you've entered the realm where medieval artists and writers immortalize dungeons in pigment and prose. In the 14th century Loutrell Psalter, you'll find whimsical marginalia depicting prisoners chained in Stahl's mainstream historical fact that monks illustrated daily hellscapes alongside prayers. You lean in close, tracing the tiny painted shackles, feeling a gentle thrill imagining their painstaking creation by candlelight. Your lantern's glow reveals fresco fragments on the damp walls, a once vibrant depiction of the harrowing of hell, where Christ descends to free souls from infernal prisons. Medieval churches often paired these dramatic scenes with real dungeons below visual sermons, reminding congregants of divine rescue amid earthly misery. Fringe tidbit: one 12th century abbey legend claims a convict's ghost appeared in a mural to warn monks of structural collapse. Historians still argue whether this was a literal visitation or clever marketing to secure rebuilding funds. You run your fingers along a carved wooden panel showing a knight's torment in a circular oubliette. This panel once adorned a noble's hall, an ironic nod to the fate awaiting traitors. A quirky aside. Some craftsmanship scholars believe the panel's sculptor snuck in a hidden self-portrait as a disgruntled journeyman, complete with a small hammer in his belt. Historians still argue whether that was cheeky humor or a premature career-limiting move. As you shuffle forward, you pass a stone niche holding a bound parchment scroll in illuminated manuscript of Dante's Inferno, translated into Middle English around 1400. Dante's vivid descriptions of ice-filled prison caverns in the ninth circle of hell shaped European perceptions of the cold, unlit oubliettes you've traversed. A modern aside flickers. You might call it the first blockbuster horror series, minus the popcorn but with comparable existential dread. To your right, a tapestry fragment shows a courtly scene beneath which lurks a hidden dungeon cell. These narrative tapestries, such as the famous Bayeux Tapestry, occasionally scroll past moments of conquest and reward, yet marginal captions warn, "Beware the vault below." Fringe sources suggest that some patrons commissioned reverse dungeon scenes to decorate private chambers, flipping the script on status. Historians still argue if these were genuine commissions or later fabrications by collectors. You pause under a vaulted arch where a medieval minstrel once recited ballads about unjust imprisonment. The unquiet grave and the gray cock hint at souls restless in shallow graves and dank cells. While not strictly dungeon literature, these ballads capture the same blend of sorrow and hope you felt yourself. A quirky note. Some minstrels purportedly hid lockpicks in their hurdy-gurdy cases, using their performances as scouting missions for potential escapes. Historians still argue whether poetry truly doubled as spycraft or just made for entertaining lore. Your boots echo across a small stage marked by a faded floor painting remnants of York Mystery Play's staging The Mouth of Hell. Actors once portrayed demons dragging sinners into mouth-like dungeon entrances, complete with rumbling sound effects from hidden bells. The local guilds invested heavily in these spectacles to teach moral lessons. Fringe anecdotes say some audience members signed up to play demons just for the chance to stomp across stage traps. Historians still argue if that enthusiasm sprang from piety or cheap thrills. A wooden lectern stands against the wall, holding a weathered codex of De Singulari Poena, a 13th century legal treatise discussing appropriate punishments for various crimes. Its margins brim with scribbled caricatures of judges turning dungeon keys into oversized comedy props, a surprising note of levity. You read a snippet where the author admonishes, "Better a brief torment than endless chains," capturing the era's debate over torture versus incarceration. Modern asides flicker. It's like arguing whether a quick reboot beats living with a perpetually slow computer. Next, you pass a stained glass window panel relocated here after the Reformation. It shows Saint Leonard, patron of prisoners, breaking chains with a hammer. Pilgrims would pray before this image, believing chain-breaking miracles could apply to spiritual as well as literal captivity. Fringe stories credit Saint Leonard with appearing in dungeons to comfort inmates, though historians still argue whether these miracles were real or hagiographical embellishments to boost pilgrimage revenue. Your path then curves past a wall of carved quotes from medieval romances, Tristan lamenting imprisonment in a cliffside cell, Isolde sending love notes carved in rock. Courtly love literature often utilized dungeon settings to heighten romantic peril. A quirky tidbit notes that some scribes added coded letters in these carvings acrostics spelling out secret lovers' names. Historians still argue whether these ciphers were purposeful or accidental byproducts of decorative script. Ahead, illuminated initials from a 15th century book of hours glow in dim light. One shows a penitent thief clutching a rosary in a cell, his plea for mercy rendered in gold leaf. These devotional books personalize the struggle for redemption, merging spiritual captivity with physical imprisonment. You can almost feel the wrist muscles that painted each leaf, a delicate labor echoing the harsh labor of prisoners below. You step into a low side chamber where fragments of wall poetry remain. Lines from the French poet Routebeuf lament starving captives and extol hope's light in the darkest pit. Scholars treasure these verses for their raw emotional power. Fringe debate swirls over whether Routebeuf penned them from personal experience. Some argue he was once imprisoned for unpaid debts. Historians still argue if that's fact or crafted legend to deepen the poetry's pathos. Against another wall hangs a modern reconstruction of a medieval prison scroll, an eccentric 19th century antiquarian's attempt to imagine cell labels, complete with faux aging techniques. It reads like performance art, complete with contrived ink burns. A quirky aside, this scroll ended up influencing 20th century dungeon-themed amusement parks more than actual medieval scholarship. Historians still argue whether ironic recreations distort or enrich our understanding of the past. Finally, you stand beneath a carved lintel reused from an old keep, now inscribed with the Latin phrase, Captivis donatur veritas. To captives is granted truth. The phrase appears in several medieval chronicles as a warning that incarcerated souls might speak secrets under pressure. Fringe anecdote. Some prisoners exploited this expectation, feigning broken spirits to lure interrogators into careless conversation, then using that intelligence to barter for favors. Historians still argue whether such strategic honesty truly saved lives or simply prolonged suffering. As you exit the art and literature gallery, you carry the echo of brushstrokes, etched words, and whispered rhymes. These creative expressions didn't just chronicle dungeon life, they shaped perceptions of captivity for generations. From illuminated margins to ballads on the breeze, medieval artists and writers wove the dread and hope of imprisonment into Europe's cultural tapestry. You step back into the main corridor, the whisper of pigments and poetry lingering at your shoulder, ready at last for the final reflection on how these hellish cells carved a legacy that still resonates today. You step back into the main corridor, its cold stones humming with echoes of every story you've traversed, from the dank entry in Section 1 to the gilded comfort of noble towers in Section 10, and realize that medieval dungeons cast shadows far beyond their earthen walls. Their legacy shaped centuries of how societies punish, protect, and even gaze at confinement. In the late 18th century, reformers borrowed directly from medieval concepts of penitence and isolation to create the first penitentiaries, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia, 1790, began housing inmates in single cells, believing solitude would foster reflection and moral reform, a mainstream historical fact. Imagine trading rat-infested raising poles for plain wooden doors and calling it progress. Your modern Airbnb review would note, no minibar, but at least no bat droppings. Yet the influence of medieval dungeons stretched further back, seeping into Tudor-era Bridewell Prison, 1553, originally a house of correction, which combined work, prayer, and mandatory labora nod to monastic discipline. Today's work release programs echo that medieval brainstorm, albeit with fewer torches. Historians still argue whether these early reformatories genuinely aimed at rehabilitation or simply shifted the burden of labor from guilds to inmates. Architecturally, the panopticon concept, late 18th century, tapped into that same medieval power play you felt under the vaults in Section 4, a central observation point commanding silent control over cells. Some fringe scholars even claim that Jeremy Bentham toured old castles to sketch his design. Others say he drew from contemporary ship decks. Historians still argue whether medieval oubliettes informed Bentham's vision or if it was pure Enlightenment invention. Either way, you'd need a neck brace and a panopticon as badly as in a bone-vaulted cell neck cramps guaranteed. Modern maximum security units often feature reinforced gates and dimly lit solitary wings, direct descendants of the oubliettes and torture chambers you inspected in Sections 3 and 6. A quirky tidbit notes that some 20th century prisons hosted ghost tours, billing themselves as authentic medieval experiences because nothing says rehabilitation like a $6 flashlight and spooky legends. Historians still debate whether such attractions trivialize incarceration or foster historical empathy. Your own reflection flickers across these corridors. The idea of doing time entered legal parlance in the 1500s, when English common law began equating imprisonment with punishment rather than mere pre-trial custodiaship, echoing through today's court systems. Some legal scholars argue it became a convenient way to warehouse the poor under the guise of order. It's like swapping a speed bump for a medieval trebuchet. Both keep you in place, but one hurts more. Countless literary works, from Shakespeare's Measure for Measure to Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, drew on the imagery of dim cells and iron collars that you've toured. Their power to evoke terror and sympathy remains strong. Contemporary prison memoirs often reference medieval metaphors of darkness and chain. Historians still argue whether such literary parallels exaggerate continuity or highlight universal aspects of confinement. You recall the strange comfort of sanctuary in Section 12, where churches once offered brief refuge. Modern concepts of safe houses and witness protection echo that medieval courtesy, albeit with better electricity and fewer incense flares. A fringe anecdote holds that one 19th century French politician proposed reviving church sanctuary for political refugees, but the idea died under a pile of bureaucratic memos. Historians still debate if such proposals were genuine or just parliamentary theater. The very word dungeon carries a weighty resonance in pop culture, from Gothic novels to video games, often divorced from its grim medieval origins. Yet every time you crouch in a virtual cell and hear the clank of pixelated chains, you're reenacting architecture carved in stone centuries ago. One quirky note: some escape room designers market medieval dungeons, complete with hidden bolts and torture props. Historians still argue whether these experiences educate or simply sanitize real suffering for entertainment. In penal theory, the pendulum swings between punishment and rehabilitation, much as it did in medieval debates you witnessed in Section 13's reform chamber. The shift toward restorative justice practices today recalls early monastic efforts to combine confinement with spiritual counsel. Yet critics point out that modern restorative circles lack the raw stone authenticity of a castle cell. You chuckle. Guess you can't get a good echo of redemption in an office conference room. Take a moment to reflect on how these hellish cells, once intended to break bodies and wills, now inform our values. Prison chaplains walk corridors lit, not by torch, but by fluorescent tubes, offering counsel much like medieval priests who descended into the depths. Solitary confinement debates reference dungeon pain as a rubric for psychological harm. Historians still argue whether extreme isolation belongs in a civilized system or should be abolished entirely. Your journey ends where it began, in the echoing stone corridors, but the lessons reverberate near and far. Medieval dungeons were more than punishment chambers. They became blueprints for built environments that control, discipline, and sometimes protect. From fortress vaults to modern prison complexes, the legacy persists in architecture, law, literature, and even entertainment. As you trudge forward, the corridor light dims, and the stones feel a touch warmer, perhaps hope seeping back in. You've seen cruelty and compassion, suffering and solace, darkness and the occasional flicker of mercy. The story of medieval dungeons is the story of our collective approach to justice, a tapestry woven from both iron chains and inked reform. Now that our journey has led us from the shadowed thresholds of medieval fortress dungeons to the corridors where penitentiaries and reformatories arose, it's time to soften the frame of your mind. The stones beneath your feet grow warm with remembrance, and the echoes of rattling chains fade into a gentle hush. You may feel the weight of history settle on your shoulders, but know that those echoes are fading into the past. Let your breathing slow as you imagine each torch's flicker dimming, each iron bar dissolving, replaced by calm, open spaces where the air flows unimpeded. Picture yourself standing in a meadow at dawn, where dewdrops cling to grass and the first bird calls drift up like angelic whispers. These dungeons, once carved to contain sorrow, now stand only in our story's monuments to how far we've come. Let the memory of dank corridors and rancid gruel dissolve, leaving room for kindness, justice, and the promise of redemption. Feel the hush of that meadow settle in your bones, the soft earth beneath your boots, and the warmth of sun on your face. As you prepare to rest, carry this final reassurance. Every iron gate once locked shut also opened, revealing new paths. Just as medieval reformers inked laws of mercy into parchments, today's voices can write kinder chapters in our collective narrative. Your insight into those ancient cells becomes a silent pledge to empathy, choosing transformation over vengeance. Let your thoughts drift, unburdened by echoes of clinking shackles. Imagine the gentle ripple of a pond at twilight, spreading outward until the surface is perfectly still. In that stillness, find peace, knowing that the darkest prisons exist only in memory. Allow your mind to float free, carried on a breeze that wafts away discomfort and lingers only on compassion's breath. Your journey is over, but its lessons will keep you mindful of justice tempered by mercy. Now, close your eyes, feel your body relax, and let the calm wash over you. Sweet dreams await beyond these stones, in a world where freedom and understanding rise above the shadows of the past. Sweet dreams.